Run. Don't look back. Winter, 1945. Dawn had not yet reached the valley when Eleanor Hayes stood at the edge of the frozen river, her boots sinking into fresh snow that covered the banks like untouched linen. The world around her seemed suspended between silence and breath. Every pine, tree-coated in silver frost, every fence post wearing a thin white crown. Nothing moved except the wind, sweeping across the open ice with a voice so low it sounded almost human. She pulled the wool blanket tighter around the tiny bundle resting against her chest. Beneath the heavy layers, 6-month-old Samuel slept in restless bursts, his small breaths warming the fabric beneath her chin. Each exhale reminded her that he was still here, still fighting the bitter cold one heartbeat at a time. Behind her, the narrow road that led back to the village disappeared into drifting snow. Less than 24 hours earlier, that road had been filled with neighbors loading handcarts, families carrying everything they believed they could not live without, faces pale with uncertainty rather than fear. Now it lay empty. Doors had been left swinging in the wind. Smoke no longer rose from chimneys. Even the church bell that had marked every Sunday morning for generations had fallen silent beneath a blanket of ice. Eleanor turned toward the river once more. It stretched nearly 300 yards across, its frozen surface glowing faintly beneath the fading stars. In warmer months, it carried fishing boats and laughing children. Today it carried only uncertainty. Somewhere beyond the opposite bank, beyond the forest darkened by winter, there were people rumored to be offering shelter, food, and warmth to those who managed to reach them. Rumors were dangerous things during wartime. Sometimes they saved lives. Sometimes they led people into deeper despair. She had no way of knowing which this one would become, but remaining where she was offered no future at all. She lowered one gloved hand to Samuel's cheek. Even through the blankets, she could feel the warmth of his tiny face, fragile and astonishing against the relentless cold. He stirred softly, his fingers curling around the edge of her scarf without ever opening his eyes. Eleanor smiled despite everything. It was the smallest smile imaginable, almost invisible beneath the frost gathering along her eyelashes, yet reminded her of evenings before the war, when candlelight filled the kitchen, bread baked in the oven, and laughter echoed through rooms that no longer existed except inside memory. The wind shifted again, carrying loose crystals of snow across the ice like scattered diamonds. She studied the frozen river the way a teacher studies a page before reading it aloud, searching for hidden cracks, uneven colors, places where the white surface turned faintly gray. Her father had taught her long ago that ice always spoke before it failed. You only survived if you listened carefully enough. She inhaled slowly, tasting the sharp air that stung her lungs. There would be no second chance once she stepped forward. No promise that the frozen surface would carry their weight. Only hope, quiet and stubborn, standing beside fear. Eleanor tightened the blanket once more, pressed her lips gently against Samuel's forehead, and lifted her eyes toward the endless sheet of winter waiting before her. Then, without another glance behind, she placed one careful foot onto the ice. The first step held. The second answered with a faint groan beneath the snow, so soft that anyone unfamiliar with winter rivers might have mistaken it for the wind. Eleanor paused, allowing the silence to settle before taking another careful breath. Her father had always insisted that panic was louder than danger. If she hurried, the ice would hear it. If she stayed calm, it might carry her a little farther. She shifted her weight slowly, keeping Samuel close against her chest beneath the thick wool blanket. The baby stirred again, releasing a tiny sigh before drifting back into uneasy sleep. His warmth was fading faster than she wanted to admit. She gently tucked another corner of the blanket beneath his chin and continued forward. The frozen surface stretched endlessly ahead, its pale color broken by long ribbons of wind-blown snow that curled across the river like ghostly waves. Every few yards she stopped, studying the changing patterns beneath her boots. Some places reflected the pale morning sky with a blue sheen. Others looked cloudy and dull. She avoided the darker patches instinctively, trusting lessons learned decades earlier beside this very river when winter had simply meant sleds, laughter, and evenings by wood stove instead of impossible choices. A sharp gust swept across the open waterway, stealing her breath and pushing against her shoulders. Eleanor leaned into it, lowering her head to protect Samuel's face from the freezing air. Tiny crystals gathered along the edge of the blanket and melted almost immediately from the warmth of the child beneath. She smiled faintly at the sight. Even surrounded by endless white, life still carried its own quiet heat. Somewhere behind the heavy clouds, dawn slowly awakened. The darkness softened into shades of gray, revealing distant pine forests standing motionless along both banks. Their branches sagged beneath thick snow, forming silent walls that seemed to watch every careful step. No birds called. No wagons rolled across hidden roads. The entire valley felt as though time itself had stopped to listen. Eleanor counted each step without realizing it. 23, 24, 25. Numbers gave her mind something solid to hold, while uncertainty surrounded everything else. She remembered counting in exactly the same way while rocking Samuel through sleepless nights after his birth, whispering nursery songs her own mother had once sung to her. Back then, the world outside their small farmhouse still felt predictable. Seasons changed. Crops grew. Families gathered around supper tables. It had seemed impossible that ordinary days could disappear so completely. A sudden sound interrupted her thoughts. Not a crack, not yet. More like a long sigh traveling somewhere beneath the frozen surface. Eleanor froze instantly. Her heartbeat became the only rhythm she could hear. She waited, eyes fixed on the pale ice below her boots. Nothing moved. The sound faded into silence once more. Slowly, carefully, she knelt just enough to spread her weight, remembering every word her father had ever spoken about respecting winter instead of challenging it. Samuel opened his eyes for the first time that morning. They were calm, impossibly blue, reflecting the dim light above them. He reached one tiny hand toward her face, brushing the frost gathered along her scarf with innocent curiosity. Eleanor felt tears sting her eyes, not from sadness, but from the overwhelming determination that rose inside her. He did not understand fear. He trusted her completely. That trust became stronger than the cold, stronger than exhaustion, stronger than every doubt that had followed her to the riverbank. She stood once more, steadying herself against the wind, and lifted her gaze toward the distant shoreline that still seemed impossibly far away. Then she took another careful step into the silent morning, carrying not only her son, but every hope she had left in the world. By the time Eleanor reached what she guessed was the middle of the river, the far shoreline looked no closer than before. Winter had a way of bending distance, making every familiar landmark seem just beyond reach. The line of pine trees ahead remained wrapped in pale mist, while the village behind her had nearly disappeared into the drifting snow. She was suspended between two worlds, one she could not return to and one she had not yet earned. The cold pressed through every layer of clothing until it settled deep inside her bones. Her boots had become heavy with packed snow, and each careful step demanded more strength than the last. She flexed her fingers around the blanket, making certain Samuel remained completely covered except for the tiny space near his nose where warm breaths escaped in soft white clouds. The steady rhythm comforted her. As long as she could see those faint wisps rising into the frozen air, she could keep moving. The sky brightened little by little. Soft gray became silver, and silver slowly welcomed the first hints of pale blue beyond the clouds. Light revealed details that darkness had hidden. Long fractures stretched beneath the ice like thin branches trapped inside clear glass. Some were old, frozen solid weeks before. Others looked newer, delicate lines that wandered beneath the surface before fading from sight. Eleanor adjusted her path instinctively, choosing the brightest sections where the ice appeared thickest. She remembered standing beside this same river as a little girl, watching her father test the frozen surface with a long wooden pole before allowing anyone onto it. He had never trusted appearances alone. Nature, he often said, rewarded patience and punished certainty. The memory arrived so vividly that for one impossible moment, she could almost smell fresh coffee drifting from her childhood kitchen and hear her mother humming while kneading bread dough beside the window. Those ordinary mornings had once seemed endless. Now they felt more precious than anything she had ever owned. Samuel suddenly opened his eyes again. This time he did not fall back asleep. He looked up at her with quiet curiosity, blinking as tiny snowflakes landed on the edge of the blanket. His small hand slipped free and rested against her coat. Eleanor gently enclosed it inside her gloved palm. It was astonishing how someone so small could carry so much hope without saying a single word. She whispered softly, her voice nearly lost beneath the wind. "Everything will be all right." The promise was made as much to herself as to him. The breeze eased for the first time that morning. Silence spread across the valley once again, so complete that she could hear the faint scrape of wool against wool as she adjusted the blanket. Then another sound emerged beneath her feet. It was different from before. Longer, deeper, a slow, rolling murmur traveling somewhere below the frozen surface. Eleanor stopped immediately. She closed her eyes and listened, allowing every lesson from years ago to return. The sound drifted away, leaving only stillness behind. She waited another full minute before daring to move. There would be no rushing now. She shortened each stride, placing her boots down with extraordinary care, never lifting the next foot until she felt the previous one settle securely. Far ahead, through the thinning curtain of morning mist, she finally noticed something she had not seen before. A weathered wooden fence stood near the opposite bank, barely visible beneath fresh snow. It was the first unmistakable sign that solid ground truly waited beyond the endless ice. Eleanor drew one slow breath after another, fixed her eyes on that distant fence, and continued forward with the quiet determination that had carried her this far. The old fence grew clearer with every passing minute, but so did the truth hidden beneath the winter morning. The brightest ice was gone. Ahead, the smooth white surface faded into broad patches of pale gray, where fresh snow had settled unevenly across the river. Eleanor slowed until each step became almost a pause. She no longer counted the distance. She counted only her breathing. One slow breath, one careful step, another breath, another step. Samuel remained quiet against her chest, wrapped securely beneath layers of wool that now carried tiny beads of melted frost. She lowered her chin and listened. His breathing was softer than before, but still steady, each gentle exhale warming the scarf near her neck. That small rhythm became the strongest sound in her world. Everything else belonged to the wind. The river answered with silence for several long moments. Then came another low murmur beneath the ice. It traveled beneath her boots like distant thunder rolling beneath the earth instead of across the sky. Eleanor froze instantly. She remembered something her father had once done during a particularly harsh winter. He had knelt on the frozen river, placed one gloved hand against the ice, and waited without speaking. When she asked what he was doing, he smiled and said, "The river always tells you the truth if you stop talking long enough to hear it." Slowly, she lowered herself onto one knee. The cold reached through the thick fabric almost immediately. She rested one hand against the frozen surface. It felt solid, smooth, and impossibly still. Yet beneath that stillness, she sensed movement far below, water continuing its endless journey beneath the heavy sheet of winter. The river was alive. It had never stopped moving. Eleanor closed her eyes for only a second before opening them again. Fear had not disappeared. It had simply become quieter than purpose. She rose carefully, shifting her weight with deliberate patience, and angled slightly upstream where the snow appeared thinner. The path was longer, but instinct told her it was safer. The wind returned without warning, sweeping across the open river with enough force to tug at the blanket wrapped around Samuel. Eleanor immediately turned her body, shielding him with her shoulders until the strongest gust passed. Tiny snow crystals danced through the air, spinning around them in glittering circles before vanishing across the ice. For a brief moment, the distant shoreline disappeared behind a curtain of white. When the air finally settled, the weathered fence came back into view, joined now by the outline of a small wooden barn standing beyond a cluster of bare trees. Civilization, shelter, warmth. They were close enough to imagine, yet still far enough to remain uncertain. Samuel let out a quiet whimper, his first sound in many minutes. Eleanor gently rocked him without stopping her careful progress. "I know," she whispered. "Just a little farther." The words floated into the frozen air, carried away almost as soon as they left her lips. She did not know whether she believed them completely, but hope often arrived before certainty. As another cautious step settled beneath her boot, a thin line appeared in the snow several feet ahead. At first it looked like nothing more than a shadow cast by the morning light. Then it lengthened. It curved across her path in a narrow arc before disappearing beneath fresh powder. Eleanor stared at it without moving. She knew exactly what it was. Not an old mark trapped beneath weeks of frozen weather, but a fresh fracture stretching quietly across the river surface. She tightened her hold on Samuel, drew one slow breath into aching lungs, and searched the endless white for the safest way around the silent warning waiting at her feet. The fracture curved gently to the left, almost graceful beneath its thin layer of drifting snow. Eleanor remained perfectly still, studying every inch of it before making another move. The river had given her a warning, not a sentence. She owed it respect. She slowly shifted 1 foot backward, testing the surface she had already crossed. The ice answered with reassuring silence. Then she looked farther upstream, where the snow had been swept away by the wind, exposing a wider stretch of clear blue ice. It meant a longer path, but perhaps a stronger one. She turned carefully, never twisting too quickly, protecting Samuel with both arms, as though the smallest sudden movement might disturb the frozen world beneath them. The detour added precious minutes. Her legs had begun to tremble from exhaustion, not with fear, but with the steady effort of balancing every ounce of her weight. Each muscle carried the ache of sleepless nights, empty cupboards, and endless uncertainty. Yet the burden in her arms never felt heavy. Samuel remained the only thing that gave direction to every step. The morning light continued to grow brighter, revealing faint reflections beneath the ice. Eleanor could now see trapped air bubbles suspended deep below the surface like strings of tiny pearls frozen in time. They reminded her that winter always hid another world beneath its beauty. She glanced toward the opposite bank again. The wooden barn now stood clearly against the white landscape. Smoke drifted from a chimney nearby, rising slowly into the still air before dissolving into the pale sky. Someone was there. Someone had found warmth while she remained surrounded by cold. That single ribbon of smoke became stronger than any promise. Samuel stirred once more. His tiny face pressed gently against her coat as though searching for more warmth. Eleanor loosened the blanket just enough to touch his cheek with her fingertips. It felt cooler than before. She immediately wrapped the wool more securely around him, tucking every loose edge beneath his small body. "Stay with me," she whispered softly. "We are almost there." The words barely escaped her lips before another sound reached her ears. It was sharper this time. A crisp snap echoed somewhere ahead, followed by complete silence. Eleanor stopped instantly. The sound had not come from beneath her feet. It had come several yards away, somewhere beyond the path she intended to take. She watched carefully. Nothing happened. Snow drifted quietly across the frozen river exactly as before. The valley remained still. Even so, she chose another direction, moving slightly toward the center where the blue ice appeared smoother and unbroken. Every decision became slower now. Every footstep required patience that bordered on prayer. She placed her left boot down, waited, shifted her weight, then moved the right. The rhythm became almost hypnotic. Breath, step, listen, breath, step, listen. At last she reached a broad stretch where the ice seemed clear and strong enough to reflect the brightening sky above. Relief almost tempted her to move faster. Almost. She resisted it. Her father had always warned that confidence arrived just before mistakes. She smiled faintly at the memory and continued exactly as before. Then, without warning, a delicate web of thin white lines appeared beneath her boots. They spread silently through the blue ice like frost racing across a window pane. Eleanor froze, her heartbeat suddenly louder than the wind. She tightened her hold on Samuel, lifted him instinctively higher against her shoulder, and waited as the river beneath them whispered once again, no longer with distant murmurs, but with the unmistakable sound of changing beneath the weight it had carried for far too long. The white lines beneath Eleanor's boots stopped spreading as suddenly as they had appeared. For one endless heartbeat, the river held its breath, and so did she. She did not dare look down again. Instead, she lifted her eyes toward the opposite bank where the weathered barn stood beneath a veil of drifting snow. It was close enough now that she could distinguish the dark outline of its door and the narrow chimney releasing a steady ribbon of smoke into the pale winter sky. Safety had never looked so ordinary. Then the ice answered. A low rolling sound rose from somewhere beneath the frozen surface, deeper than before, carrying through the soles of her boots and into her chest. It was not loud. It was calm, almost patient, as though the river were reminding her that every step still carried a price. Eleanor slowly bent her knees, lowering her center of gravity exactly as her father had taught her years ago. She cradled Samuel higher against her shoulder until his tiny face rested safely above the thick folds of the blanket. His eyes remained closed once again. His breathing was faint but steady, each warm breath brushing softly against her neck. She whispered a quiet prayer that disappeared into the wind before it reached another soul. Without lifting her feet completely, she began sliding them across the surface instead of stepping. The movement felt awkward, but spread her weight more gently across the frozen river. Inch by inch, she moved forward. The silence became almost sacred. Every sound seemed magnified. The soft scrape of leather against snow. The whisper of wool brushing her coat. The distant sigh of wind weaving through bare branches along the shoreline. Nothing else existed. Then from somewhere beyond the barn, a dog barked. Once, then again. Eleanor stopped instantly. A second later, another sound followed. A human voice, too distant to understand, yet unmistakably real. She turned her head slightly toward the shoreline. Near the fence, she noticed movement for the first time that morning. A man stepped from behind the barn, carrying an armful of firewood. He paused, staring across the frozen river as though he had seen something unexpected against the endless white landscape. Eleanor wanted to call out, but the air inside her lungs refused to become sound. She simply raised one gloved hand a few inches before lowering it again, unwilling to risk any sudden movement. The man stood motionless for another moment. Then he dropped the firewood into the snow and disappeared behind the barn at a full run. Eleanor did not know whether he was searching for help or whether she had imagined the entire encounter. She could not afford to wait for the answer. She continued sliding carefully across the ice, never breaking the slow rhythm that had carried her this far. The shoreline seemed to inch closer with every breath. Bare willow branches now reached over the riverbank, their frozen tips sparkling beneath the growing morning light. Hope settled quietly beside her fear, neither stronger than the other, simply sharing the same fragile space inside her heart. Then, only a few yards ahead, the ice gave a sudden sharp pop that echoed across the valley like a tree branch snapping in winter. Eleanor froze once more. Tiny ripples appeared beneath the clear blue surface far below, moving silently under the ice toward the bank. She tightened her embrace around Samuel, lifting him instinctively even higher, while somewhere beyond the willows hurried footsteps crunched through fresh snow, drawing closer with every passing second. The footsteps grew louder with every passing second, muted by fresh snow, yet unmistakable against the quiet valley. Eleanor did not turn toward them. Her attention remained fixed on the narrow stretch of ice between herself and the riverbank. She could see individual reeds now, their brittle stalks rising through the snow like faded brushstrokes against the white landscape. The willows leaned over the shoreline, their long frozen branches reaching toward the river as though nature itself wished to shorten the distance she still had to travel. Another sharp sound echoed beneath her boots. This time it came directly below her. The delicate white lines trapped inside the blue ice widened ever so slightly before becoming still again. Eleanor lowered herself carefully, almost crouching, keeping Samuel high against her shoulder. His blanket had collected a fine layer of sparkling frost, but his tiny face remained tucked safely beneath the thick wool. She could feel the steady warmth of his breathing against her neck. That single sensation pushed every other thought aside. Nothing else mattered. Not the cold, not the aching in her legs, not the uncertainty waiting beneath the frozen river. Only one more yard, then another. Behind the line of willows, 3 figures suddenly emerged from the trees. The first was the older man she had glimpsed near the barn. Beside him ran a younger man wearing a heavy winter coat and carrying a long coil of thick rope over one shoulder. A third followed, several steps behind, with what looked like a wooden ladder balance between both hands. They stopped at the riverbank without stepping onto the ice. The older man cupped his hands around his mouth. His voice carried clearly across the frozen surface this time. "Do not hurry. Stay exactly where the ice feels strongest." Eleanor nodded once. Speaking required more strength than she could spare. The younger man immediately dropped to one knee near the bank, studying the frozen surface with the same careful attention her father once had. He pointed slightly upstream. "Keep coming toward the willows. The current runs slower there." Eleanor shifted her path only a few feet, moving exactly as he directed. She slid each foot forward without lifting it, waiting after every movement until the ice answered with silence. The rope remained coiled beside the young man. He did not throw it yet. They all understood that sudden movement could accomplish the very thing they hoped to avoid. Patience remained the safest rescue. The distance slowly disappeared. 20 feet. 15. 10. Eleanor could now distinguish the concern in their faces. They were strangers, yet none of them looked at her with fear or suspicion. Their eyes never left the small bundle resting against her shoulder. Samuel stirred quietly, releasing a soft cry that drifted through the crisp morning air. The older man's expression changed instantly. Hope replaced worry. "He is still strong," he called gently. "Keep coming." Eleanor managed the faintest smile. It lasted only a heartbeat before another deep rumble rolled beneath the ice, vibrating through the frozen river with greater force than before. Everyone fell silent. The younger man carefully uncoiled the rope while remaining flat against the snow near the shoreline. He extended one end toward Eleanor without crossing onto the river. It landed several feet beyond her reach, close enough to promise safety, far enough that she would still need to take a few careful steps alone. Eleanor looked at the rope, then down at the narrow stretch of ice that separated them. She drew one slow breath, tightened her embrace around Samuel, and prepared to close the final distance with the same quiet courage that had carried them across the river from the very first step. The rope rested quietly on the ice between Eleanor and the waiting men, its rough fibers dusted with fresh snow. She measured the distance with tired eyes. Only a few feet remained, yet they felt longer than the entire journey behind her. She slid her left foot forward, waited. The river remained silent. Then her right. Another pause. Every movement carried the same careful respect that had guided her since stepping onto the frozen surface before dawn. Samuel shifted gently beneath the blanket, releasing a sleepy sigh that seemed almost impossibly peaceful after everything they had endured. Eleanor smiled without realizing it. The sound reminded her that hope could survive even the longest winter. The younger man slowly pushed the rope another foot across the ice using the wooden ladder, careful not to place his own weight beyond the riverbank. "That is enough," he called softly. "Do not reach too quickly." Eleanor nodded. She lowered herself just enough to extend one gloved hand, while keeping Samuel safely supported against her shoulder with the other arm. Her fingertips brushed the rope, but could not quite close around it. She exhaled slowly, shifted only a few inches closer, and tried again. This time the rough hemp settled firmly inside her hand. She did not pull. She simply held it. The younger man wrapped the opposite end around his forearm without adding tension. "We move together," he said calmly. "Only when you are ready." Eleanor answered with another quiet nod. She took one careful step. The rope remained loose. Another step. The older man watched the ice instead of watching her, reading its surface with the practiced eyes of someone who had spent decades beside this river. "Keep your pace," he said gently. "The bank is stronger than it looks. 5 more feet. 4. 3. Eleanor could now see individual blades of frozen grass emerging through the snow at the shoreline. The scent of burning firewood drifted toward her on the light breeze, warm and familiar, carrying memories of ordinary evenings before the world had changed. She had almost forgotten what a home smelled like. The final step carried her boot onto packed snow instead of ice. For a brief moment, she did not move. She simply stood there, uncertain whether to believe the solid ground beneath her feet. Then the younger man carefully reached forward and steadied her elbow. Not pulling, not rushing, simply making certain she remained balanced. The older man gently lifted one corner of the blanket, smiling when he saw Samuel blinking up at the pale winter sky. "Welcome, little one," he whispered. "You made it." Eleanor felt her knees weaken with relief more than exhaustion. The men guided her toward the warmth of the barn, where the open doorway released golden light onto the snow. Inside, a cast iron stove glowed softly, filling the room with gentle heat that slowly chased the cold from the air. A woman with silver hair hurried forward, carrying thick quilts warmed beside the fire. Without asking questions, she carefully wrapped another blanket around Samuel before placing a steaming cup of broth into Eleanor's trembling hands. No speeches filled the room. No one asked where she had come from or why she had risked the crossing. In that quiet farmhouse, kindness arrived before curiosity. Eleanor looked down at Samuel as color slowly returned to his tiny cheeks. He opened his eyes, reached toward the flickering firelight, and wrapped his small fingers around one of hers. Outside, the frozen river remained silent beneath the bright winter sun. But inside that humble barn, warmth quietly proved that sometimes the greatest rescues begin with strangers who choose compassion before they choose questions. Edit 30 years later. The river looked smaller than Samuel remembered from the stories. Winter had returned to the valley with the same quiet patience, laying fresh snow across the banks and coating the old willow branches in silver. The weathered fence was gone, replaced by a newer one built decades earlier, but the bend in the shoreline had not changed. Neither had the slow current hidden beneath the ice. Samuel stood there with his own young daughter beside him, her mittened hand wrapped around 2 of his fingers as they watched the pale morning light spread across the frozen water. She was 8 years old, curious about everything, especially the framed photograph that had rested for as long as she could remember on the mantel above the fireplace.